Good morning, everyone. I hope that you can hear me well enough, and thank you for coming on to the Zoom session. As I explained, since we already have two canceled classes because of public holidays, so to arrange a third makeup would have been quite difficult. So, but thank you for coming to this session. And in any case, for anyone who is unable to be here for any reason, I am recording this, and the video will be available. Okay, so just to let you know that, and so let's carry on. Uh, as I did last time, I'm just trying to prepare you for the individual written assignment, since it does carry 40% of the assessment. And as has been said, we are comparing two multilingual societies in terms of their respective sociolinguistic landscapes. Now, I've last time introduced to you what I would consider to have been an A grade paper. Well done. This time I'm going to be introducing to you another paper. This one was a bit problematic. It does have the statement of aims and hypothesis, as you can see here. They list out the three main aims of the study: to investigate how the choice of language on restaurant signs reflects the local social linguistic policies. To analyze, the second was to analyze the quality of translations on restaurant signs in Yanbian and Kashgar, and particularly in terms of consistency with standard Mandarin. And three, to explore how everyday communication and the education system influence language choices on signage. And then they also do have sort of summing up what they hope to achieve. This essay hopes to better understand the role of language in public signage and how these signs reveal the interplay between regional language practices and the social forces. As far as the literature review, it's it isn't very long, doesn't take up much, as you can see, just really a paragraph. It includes several sources that are mentioned and so on. Not very extensive, and in fact will prove a bit problematic in a moment, as we'll see. It covers the rationale for the choices of which multilingual societies they were going to be looking at, and what kind of public displays they were going to be paying attention to. In particular, they were looking at restaurant signs. Then they had a section on the analysis and the discussion, and these sections, like the previous paper, a good practice, and that is that the sections follow the research questions that were laid out at the beginning. So provide something of an outline, which then is elaborated and carried out through the paper. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the various what was discussed. So they had the first was the comparative analysis of restaurant plaques in two regions, looking at translation issues. That was a focus. That was fine. Looking at how the use of Chinese phrases and how it compares with standard Mandarin syntax and so on. And then they deal with analyzing the impact of daily communication, educational systems, and break it down: daily communication, education system. So organization, very good. It covers what was it dealt with the topic, was clear in terms of the aims and what it hoped to achieve, leading up to a conclusion. And the conclusion, again, is well stated. So far, I would have been quite impressed with this paper, with this. But then I got to the references. Now, you won't be able to see the problem here, but there is a very, very severe problem. What that severe problem is this. Okay, go back to what was in the literature review. In the literature review, you had one, two, three, four, five references. Okay, look for those in the references. They're not there. All the source, all that was cited in the paper as far as the literature review, and none of it appears in the references except for that one, Shohami. But then even look at the reference. It's Shohami is the third author in three authors' paper, the first one. And that is the wrong way to cite it, okay? You use the name of the first author, and when you're citing it, not the last author in the reference, okay? But notice, none of these sources mentioned in the literature review appear in the references. Last point. None of the references appear in the paper. That was really odd. Why you have all the references that you mention here, none of them appear in the paper. And all the things that you cite as part of your literature review, none of it appears in the references. That really made this paper very problematic. Be careful. What you cite in the paper should be in the references, of course. And what your list of references, well, these should be what you have referred to in the paper. So in this case, this proved to be a very problematic case. I really don't understand what the problem was that the student had. Okay, so as far as organization, as far as what they were covering, it was going for a very good assessment, very good result. But in the end, what really did it in were the references. A very unfortunate outcome for the student's work. Okay, here is the QR code for today's lecture. Now, I just want to see if any of you if there's any problem with what is what is happening. Can you hear me well enough? No.
Yes, we can.
You can. Okay, well, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to carry on and we'll continue with the topic for today. Just a moment. Okay, today, chapter 5. I hope you've taken a look at it. Pigeons and creoles. Now, you might think, why is this so interesting? It's interesting and in fact becomes very, very controversial. There are really very strong feelings when it comes to is a creole formed from a pigeon? Or is it formed from the fact that people were just two languages in contact and formed by that? And there are really heated arguments. Now, I'm going to today be showing you some video clips, and the video clips are looking at these scholars that are really engaged in quite a heated argument against each other on this topic. And we'll try to get sort of both of their views so that we can see how they are coming at it. I will have one video that will sort of be more neutral in presenting the topic, which I really found an excellent summary of what are the issues in dealing with Pidgin and Creole. So as we go through today, I do like the videos I include here uh, because I really want you to hear the people that are engaged in this topic. I find it quite interesting. You read their names in a book and you hear their name, but you don't make a connection with who they are and the arguments that they're making about the topic, pigeons and creoles. And the big topic is a creole. How is it formed? All right, so we'll come to that as we go on. First topic, very simple. No argument here. Lingua francas. What is a lingua franca? UNESCO defined it as a language which is used habitually by people whose mother tongues are different in order to facilitate communication between them. So it's a language that is used very commonly by people that have different, that come from different languages. So English is an obvious lingua franca. Arabic, associated with the spread of Islam. Mandarin, Hindi, Swahili, these serve as a language that sort of covers a wide expanse of communities where there are different other languages also being spoken. Now, when we deal with languages in contact with each other, usually what we would identify is a super straight language. And the idea of super sort of level is sort of the higher level language. And there's usually just one, and it's socially, economically, politically, it's the dominant language. In a multilingual context, you have several languages, one dominates. And in that context, you might see a pidgin or Creole develop. Now, this super straight language is usually the language which provides the vocabulary. We call it the lexifier language. Well, if you have a super straight language, you also have a substrate, not one language, but several substrate languages, two or more. And these are the native languages of the speakers. Now, these also contribute to the development of the pidgin, the Creole. They also, yes, provide some vocabulary, but also the phonological system, the grammatical structures. We saw some of this last week when we were talking about the situation in Malaysia and Bahasa Malay, a kind of development of a language that grows out of a contact situation. Now, the substrate languages are the speakers of these languages are usually going to be sort of socially subordinate to the superstrate language speakers. So that makes sense, right? Because those speakers of the dominant language, they're more probably going to be socially dominant as well. Okay, pidgin. Pidgin languages. They develop in situations in which speakers have no common language other than the superstrate. In other words, you brought together a lot of speakers of a wide variety of different languages. They don't speak the same language, but there's one super straight language which is common to all of them. Now, however, because the exposure to that super straight language is limited, so they don't actually acquire the super straight. I think we've got the picture. Where does it occur? Mass migrant labor. You bring in people from different countries to be the labor force. They speak different languages, but then there's going to be one super straight language which they have in common, but none of them have the exposure, the time, or whatever to learn that language, just bits of it. Increased trade, so on. Well, of course, we can go on and we will see some mass migrant labor, increased trade, that sounds quite all right. But also, we'll see that the slave trade was very much a factor in producing pigeons. Now, people with a variety of linguistic backgrounds, they can need to communicate with each other, and one language is very much socially dominant. Okay, we got the idea. I'm going to clear my throat. Excuse me just a moment. Okay, pigeon formation generally involves some kind of simplification of a language. What do we mean? In what way does it simplify? Well, reduction in morphology, as we will see, suffixes, prefixes, affixes, all right, are are more likely to be gone. Okay, you would have like singer, drop the er. How do they get around it? Well, usually they get around it with other words spoken together. Syntax, grammatical structure will be simplified. There will be a tolerance of considerable phonological variation. So accent will not be important. Pronunciation will not be that important. They'll be highly tolerant. Remember, the whole thing of a pigeon is very pragmatic, okay? They need to get the job done. They're in contact with one another. They come from different languages. They have that one super straight language that they can sort of refer to, but they're going to simplify it. Morphology, syntax, phonology. At the same time, the number of functions. I mean, they only need it to get the work done. No, they're not going to write a novel. They're not going to expansively use it for purposes other than the simple, direct purpose for which this pigeon began to be developed. Okay, I'm going to give a quote here from Winford. Winford said that so-called pigeonization, I'm interested in that word, so-called. All right, so-called pigeonization is really a complex combination of different processes of change, including reduction, simplification of input materials. What are input materials? Different languages. Internal innovation, so there will be some changes, and regularization of structure, with L1 influence also playing a role. So they're learning that super straight language, but their first language, which is a substrate language, one of them, there'll be more than one, it will influence, it will play a role. So pigeonization covers quite a few aspects. Question you might be asking is imperfect second language learning a kind of pigeonization? So if I'm a learner of Mandarin and I'm sort of not speaking pure Mandarin, and changes come about in what is the outcome. Well, no, that's not pigeonization. What's the difference? One interlanguage is just some idiosyncratic production. In other words, it's just me. I'm learning the second language. I'm learning another language, and I'm influenced by my first language, and I'm going to the grammar, the phonology, the tone, all these factors won't come out like a normal Mandarin speaker, right? So that's the interlanguage. But a pigeon is different. A pigeon is something which is spoke. It is the production of a number of it's of a community. Okay, It becomes conventionalized. It becomes like a simplified code that is being used by a number of speakers with a similar sort of situation that required this use of this code. So a pigeon is a code. It's a code that becomes conventionalized. It becomes a way of speaking for a particular group of people, community, and so forth. It is not just one individual's. The term is interlanguage. When I make errors, when I change the L2, the target language, and it doesn't exactly come out as I would have liked, well, that is different. That's not a pigeon. Okay, pigeon, it's a code. It's a conventionalized system of communication used by a community of users. An interlanguage is just some individuals learning of another language and the result, the outcome. So pigeons are simplified languages. They are a language. They have taken on a particular, they're recognized. Pigeons are used in contexts in which there is a continued contact with the lexifier language, the superstrate. Not to say that the substrate languages don't contribute vocabulary, they do. And a continuum between the pigeon and the lexifier develops. Okay, so there will be sort of a development of a Klein continuum between this pigeon, which has developed, and the superstrate language. And there will be speakers arranged along this in terms of, well, one thing will be how aware they are of the superstrate language, the lexifier. Are they limited on and not really don't have that much access to the lexifier language? Then their speech will be at the other end, so toward the pigeon end, and so on. Okay, so a pigeon, it develops as a code among a community of users, and it gradually expands. It becomes stabilized. It becomes conventionalized. So then, in some cases, this expanded pigeon becomes used by children in a community. It becomes almost like a home language, and it becomes more elaborated. It becomes more regularized grammatically. It acquires registers. Its functional domain is expanding so they can be used in different social contexts. It may even become the first language of the next generation. So what are we approaching? We are approaching a Creole. The language develops, it becomes used at the home, in the home. Children begin to use it, becomes regularized. It's becoming a Creole. A Creole and a pigeon, what's the difference? The difference is nativization. Now, the next part here, it is controversial. It is questioned. In fact, almost scholars on both sides of the Creole debate more or less do not agree with this, but it's in your textbook. And so let's look at it. The role of first language acquisition is key to the development of Creole languages from pidgin languages. There has been an assumption, but which has now become less credible, and that is that who began the Creoles? How did the Creoles begin? They began with the children. So this next part, typically Creoles are developed by children who find themselves born into a multilingual environment. in which the most important language for peer contact is a pidgin. Do children play a role? Yes. Is it typically that a Creole, is it typical that a Creole is what has been developed by children? Well, that is not necessarily the case. Can adults play a role as well? Most would say yes. But the first line, the distinction between a pidgin and Creole is about nativization. That is absolutely the case. Elaboration occurs when there is a group of speakers. Now we're talking about what is nativization. Elaboration occurs when there is a group of speakers who use that code, the pidgin, for regular communication. Discourse plays the major role in Creole development. That makes sense. Not just that it's from children. It's the discourse expands its role and it becomes a Creole. Now, while there are languages which are simplified and non-native, those exist. We call them pidgins. And those which are elaborated and native, have gone through a process of nativization, they become a home language. They become the language that is spoken by that community. These would be a Creole. So depending on sort of the history, there do seem to be languages that, for example, in the slave trade, Africa, slaves were brought from different places in Africa. They spoke different languages. Okay, so the Atlantic Ocean, possibly the Indian Ocean, the pidgins and Creoles, they come from an African substrate. In other words, this would have been slaves that were brought from Africa to other places. And where you notice these pidgins developing would be places that border the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean and so forth. Now, what about the Pacific Ocean? Pacific Ocean would have the language characteristics of the native ancestral languages of those lands that are part of the Pacific, that are around the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so the Atlantic pidgins and Creoles. Now these would be, as I said, African slaves. They're multilingual. They spoke languages of similar structure, different vocabulary. They tended to treat English and French, to a lesser extent Portuguese, in the same way. Now, what similarities they have, they owe to the fusion of this European and African components. Okay, so these would be the Atlantic Ocean, possibly also the Indian Ocean, pidgins and Creoles. McWhorter, John McWhorter. Do you remember him? Remember him? We, in the first lecture, we saw a talk that he gave about texting from Columbia University. McWhorter is a Creolist. He's one of these experts, one of these scholars that have studied pidgins and Creoles. That has been his main scholarly work, and he has come up with what's called the Afrogenesis hypothesis. This is it. Similarities among Atlantic pidgins and Creoles can be accounted for if we look back to the beginnings of the slave trade, the existence of English and French slave forts on the West African coast. In these forts, contact languages developed, with the most important of these from the point of view of being West African Pidgin Portuguese. Contact languages developed, with the most important of these from this point of view, from the idea of developing from this point of view. What that means is from the point of view of the slave trade, from African slaves, The one that was developed and most well known is the West African Pigeon Portuguese. Oh, one of the questions is why were there no Spanish-based Creoles? Why? English, French, Portuguese. Why not Spain? Well, several historical reasons. They came late to the sugar industry. They did not use labor-intensive cultivation systems. They sometimes took areas from Portugal, but they did not originally settle it, and they did not have large slave forts and settlements in Africa. So the point that's made is like all other languages, Creoles have complex histories of development, which involve multiple factors, language contact being one of those factors. All right, this is the video. It's Martin Hilpert. He presents a very neutral sort of presentation about pigeons and Creoles. Neutral and important because what we'll see later will be, for example, McWhorter. McWhorter will have one view, and there's another scholar, Michel de Graaf, who will present another view, and they are really at odds with each other. Okay, and we'll see both of them and both of why and how they argue against each other. But I wanted one which was a video which would present a sort of neutral stance, sort of fair and balanced approach. And I think Martin Hilpert accomplishes that with this video. So please pay attention to this. Now, this QR code, what I'm going to be doing from now on, one of your classmates asked me last week, can they have the link for videos that I show so that they can go back and see those videos later? So what I'm doing here, you see at the top is the highlighted URL, the link from YouTube. That's quite a lot to have to type in. Yeah, you can copy and paste it in. But I also thought give you this QR code, and not now. You'll be watching the video. You can watch it later. One point to make, and that is when I show you videos, I usually edit these videos. I take out parts, all right, because I don't feel it's necessary to show you the full length video. So, for example, in this video I'm going to show you, this is part 2 of the video that he's presenting. The first part, if you want to see it, well, the QR code is here. You can see the full length video. Please, another time, not today. And but today, just to let you know, I will give you the links and I will give you the QR code for the videos that I show you in class. And just to point out to you that when you do download them and look at them, you will probably notice that most of the videos are lengthier than what I've actually shown you in class. And that is because I've sort of extracted out what I feel is the most important. Okay? So let's listen to this video.
The second part of this video, in which I want to talk about pigeons and Creoles more generally. I have 3 questions that I want to discuss.
Sorry.
Namely, first of all, quite basically, what are...
Excuse me, sorry.
The second part of this video, in which I want to talk about pigeons and Creoles more generally. I have 3 questions that I want to discuss. Namely, first of all, quite basically, what are pigeons and Creoles? Then, can Creoles be distinguished from other languages? Do they form a separate class of languages? And then the third question, how do Creoles develop? As I said earlier, these are questions that have generated heated debates, so everything that you're about to hear is one opinion among several others. I'll try to make clear what is more or less agreed upon and what is more controversial, and then you can decide for yourself how to proceed further. Yeah, you're going to have to read up on these controversies and form an opinion of your own. Okay, So, what are pigeons and creoles? Let me start with pigeons because we've already seen an example, Nigerian pigeon, and anyway, pigeons are a bit easier to define than creoles. So, here's a quote by Michel de Graaf, professor of linguistics at MIT, a well-known Creole specialist and also a native speaker of Haitian Creole. What he says about pigeons is the following. Pigeons are simplified, lexically and structurally reduced, unstable non-native systems with variable and inconsistent patterns created and used for limited communication among adults who are native speakers of mutually unintelligible languages. Let's take this apart, starting with the end. Pigeons are created and used for limited communication among adults who are native speakers of mutually unintelligible languages. This is typical of trade colony scenarios. Speakers without a common language try to communicate for a limited purpose, and that purpose is usually trade. In the initial stages of this process, the pigeon is necessarily variable and inconsistent. Yeah, you recognize that part of de Graaf's definition. Everybody uses the pigeon a little differently, and there are at first no conventions on how to do things conventionally. Every speaker uses their best guess as to how to make the communication successful. Early pigeons are therefore unstable, non-native systems. And because they are produced by speakers who don't have any common tool of communication, they are lexically and structurally reduced. Think about it this way. When you establish a first contact, you don't use highly specific vocabulary because that would reduce your chances of successful communication. And you also don't use highly complex syntax because, again, that would make your point harder to understand. You try to achieve communicative success by using as few words as possible and as basic a syntax as possible. Yeah? So this is a strategy that is chosen by speakers who have a full-fledged L1. So it's not because the speakers of a pigeon don't have the ability to use language to its fullest extent. It's because they're in a situation where you need to communicate with someone who doesn't speak your language and you don't speak theirs. Moving on to creoles, de Graaf has the following to say. Arguably, a creole is a pigeon that has become a full-fledged language by stabilization and expansion as the pigeon acquires native speakers and or becomes the primary language, the vernacular, for some or most of its speakers. You notice that de Graaf hedges this by arguably, which we'll come to in just a minute. The crucial notion here is the acquisition of native speakers. A creole is someone's native language, and it's used as the main primary tool of communication. In the process, there is stabilization, that is, what used to be variable and unsystematic in pigeons becomes more systematic and conventionalized in creoles. And there is expansion, that is, the creole is used across all domains of life, and it is fleshed out in terms of its lexicon, which becomes more diversified, and its grammar, which builds up complexity. So, just to review the differences very quickly, pigeons don't have L1 speakers, creoles do. Pigeons are used for a limited range of purposes. Creoles can be used in all domains of life. Pigeons, at least at first, are highly variable and inconsistent. Creoles systematize. Pigeons have a limited vocabulary, and creoles have a more diversified lexicon. Pigeons tend to not have inflection. Creoles, well, they do have some inflection, even though, as we'll see, inflection is more or less the exception. Creoles tend to have periphrastic constructions more so than inflection. Okay, something that puzzled me when I was first taught this as a student was I wondered how pigeons could ever persist since they would turn into creoles after one generation of speakers. Okay, so how can a pigeon from the 1600s or 1700s still be spoken today? Shouldn't it have turned into a creole by now? Well, Pidgins can persist if they are only used as second languages, yeah? If they never become a home language. In trade colonies, contact between two languages may be sporadic, so that you only use the pidgin every now and so it's nobody's main home language. And even later, after colonialism, a pidgin may stay a lingua franca that you sort of know and that you use every now and then, but that is not your main language. Okay, so everything you see on this slide is relatively uncontroversial. So let's get to the issues that are a little more contested, which includes the question of whether creoles really come from pidgins. But first, can creoles be distinguished from other languages? Do they form a separate language type? Earlier in this video, I mentioned that there is a long history of colonialist discourse that presented creoles as languages that are different. So this question will always have an echo of that ideology. What is agreed upon is that creoles develop under specific socio-historical conditions. They develop on plantation colonies where enslaved people are under the obligation to use the language of the colonizers with relatively little exposure to that language. The enslaved people speak several different L1s, and at least at first they do not know each other, or they're even kept from getting to know each other. Several traditions of Creole studies have argued that this social history is really all that different Creoles have in common, meaning that Creoles can be defined socially, but they cannot be defined in terms of linguistic structure. The paper that you saw earlier with the title "The World's Simplest Grammars Are Creole Grammars" argues a different point. McWhorter argues that old languages, such as English or Spanish or Portuguese, have built up considerable complexity that does not serve any functional purpose in present-day use. So McWhorter clearly doesn't glorify old languages. He simply mentions that, well, they build up complexity that doesn't have any purpose, any functionality. For example, in English, you sometimes have to use the definite determiner the, sometimes you have to use the indefinite determiner a, and sometimes no determiner at all. So, can you explain to me why it is grammatical to say in July without the article, but it's not grammatical to say in evening? Yeah? It has to be in the evening. That's the kind of complexity that McWhorter talks about. It's very hard to learn for L1 learners because it doesn't follow any discernible logic. And so it's what McWhorter calls ornamental complexity. It's nice to have, but it doesn't serve any purpose. McWhorter argues that Creoles, because of their relatively recent history, have not yet had the time to develop ornamental complexity. So he identifies a Creole prototype, which he defines as a language with no inflection, with no tone, and with no lexicalization, at least not a very long history of lexicalization. No inflection means that grammatical information is not expressed through affixes, things like plural suffixes or past tense suffixes, case endings, and so on and so forth. Creoles do express grammatical information, but with other means, namely with separate words, what linguists call periphrastic constructions. Empirically, Creoles do show a relative absence of inflection. So on this slide, you see data from 4 Romance-based Creoles, Angolar, Palanquero, Papiamento, and Seychellois, and you see that for many grammatical categories, those 4 don't have any affixes. Case, number, gender, person, tense, mood, aspect, the usual suspects where you would see affixes on verbs or nouns, and here the table is actually pretty empty. Now, there are old languages that have little or no inflection, and perhaps you know one of those or even speak one of those. If any of you speaks Mandarin Chinese, for instance, or Vietnamese, they don't have affixes. Are they Creoles? No, they're not. And they're not because they have what linguists call tone. That is, the pitch or the pitch contour with which you pronounce a word changes the meaning of that word. It acts phonemically, like a phoneme. Creoles don't have tone, which makes them different. So if a language does not have affixes and it does not have tone either, that makes it likely to be a Creole, but there's one more feature, namely lexicalization. Lexicalization means that there are old words that have parts which no longer mean what they used to mean. Take an English word such as understand. Understand has two parts, under and stand, but you and I know that understand semantically is definitely not the combination of under and stand. Or take another example, husband. Do you recognize the first part of husband? You can probably figure it out. Yeah, it's house. But for a present-day speaker, of course, there's no relation between husband and house. I guess you could make one up, yeah, but you weren't aware of this when you were using the word husband a couple of weeks ago. So that is lexicalization. Old words have parts which no longer mean what they used to mean, and Creoles tend not to have that. In the Nigerian pidgin text that we saw earlier, the expression people way they do dirty carry work, there we have every semantic component expressed by a separate word. Okay, so this is sort of the opposite phenomenon of lexicalization, a very analytic presentation of complex ideas where every component idea corresponds to a separate word. Right, so this is McWhorter's Creole prototype. No inflection, no tone, no lexicalization. If all criteria are met, we likely have a Creole, and we have defined it in structural terms, not in socio-historical ones. Michel de Graaf argues explicitly against this, and he makes the point that I mentioned earlier, namely that defining Creoles in terms of the absence of features, the absence of features that quote-unquote normal languages have, that is a discursive move that has, at the very least, some highly problematic antecedents, namely terms such as broken English, non-standard, or primitive. Also, the ideas that Creoles are young languages is open to fairly unfortunate misunderstandings or misrepresentations. Namely, the idea that Creoles somehow recapitulate the early evolution of language. So this in turn frames Creole speakers as pre-hominids or early hominids. And you can see how that is not exactly the thing that you would like to hear as a speaker of a Creole language. Yeah? So you can see that these issues lead directly into highly controversial discussions. And this, of course, brings me to the third and last question for this video, namely, how do Creoles develop? I want to contrast two positions here, namely what is called uniformitarianism, or the uniformitarian hypothesis on the one hand, and Creole exceptionalism on the other. The uniformitarian hypothesis is championed, among others, by Sally Kokomo-Fuene, also by Michel de Graaf. Creole exceptionalism is put forward by John McWhorter. Okay, so what do they say? Mufwene holds that Creoles are contact languages. That is probably something that everyone can agree on. But where he departs from what many other Creolists are saying is that Creoles, for him, don't develop out of pidgins. He calls this a myth. And then he argues that the features that Creoles exhibit are due to founder effects. So the varieties that come together when Creoles first emerge, they have features that then combine and yield the Creoles that we see spoken today. McWhorter, on the other hand, argues for what he calls Creole exceptionalism. So he subscribes to the idea that pidgins develop into Creoles. So Creoles are pidgins at first and are then extended and they stabilize and they form Creoles. And McWhorter argues that a break in transmission leads to the loss of superfluous ornamental complexity, and that this leads to the emergence of the Creole prototype. Okay, I want to look at both views in a bit more detail. So how does Mufwene support the uniformitarian hypothesis? To start out with, he observes that present-day pidgins and creoles are spoken in different parts of the world. You saw this earlier in this video in the map that I showed, where the creoles are spoken and where the pidgins are spoken. So we have lots of creoles in the Caribbean. There are not many pidgins spoken in the Caribbean. Yeah? Why is that? Shouldn't there be the remnants, no? The first stages of the creoles somehow retained? They don't appear to be. Yeah? So pidgins arise through sporadic trade contact, and creoles develop on plantations. Creoles are the result of repeated cycles of adult acquisition of an L2. A first group of enslaved people learns a variety of English, and then newly arriving groups of enslaved people learn from the first group, and so on and so forth. So there are multiple cycles of learning. And Mufwena also argues that the role of children in Creole formation is limited. What I learned at university was that children are really mainly responsible for a pidgin developing into a Creole. Interestingly, neither Mufwene nor McWater hold on to that position. Okay, so let's turn to Creole exceptionalism and John McWater. When adult L2 learners create a pidgin, they leave aside features that are unnecessary for communicative success. I mentioned that earlier. So when you are trying to make a successful trade, you are not going to sabotage your own efforts by using words that are highly rare or complicated and syntactic patterns that run the risk of you being misunderstood. So these features are then conspicuously absent from Creole grammars, namely inflection, tone, or lexicalization. So even when the known input languages have complex features in one area of grammar, the resulting Creole will tend to reduce that complexity. And McWater gives an example for that, namely the Creole palanquero that we saw earlier in the table with the missing inflections. So palanquero is based on the West African language Kikongo and on Spanish. And we know that both Kikongo and Spanish are highly inflecting languages. Palanquero, on the other hand, does not have a lot of inflections. So if Creoles were just language mixtures, McWater argues, wouldn't we expect that a mixture of Kikongo and Spanish would mix and match the affixes of the two languages so that also the Creole would be highly inflecting? Yeah? Instead, we see that many grammatical categories that Kikongo and Spanish express morphologically with affixes are not expressed at all in Palanquero. Yeah? At the very least, this is a puzzle that is in need of an explanation. Right, so there are many complexities that I have not been able to fit into this video, but I would strongly encourage you to explore further for yourself. For example, by watching lectures by Salikoko Mufwene, by Michel de Graaf, and by John McWater. All three of them have a tendency not to mince words, so they will tell you pretty much exactly how they disagree with each other. So be prepared for that. Yeah, that's all from me at this point. I hope to see you again for the next video. And until then, thanks for watching and bye-bye.
Okay, I think that he presents quite a uh, fair and balanced perspective on pigeons and creoles. And these were the questions that he posed. I'm just going to go through and reinforce some of the points that he made. We're looking at, can creoles be distinguished from other languages, or is it just two languages come together, languages in contact? And how then do creoles develop? So what are pigeons and creoles? Now, he gives a very good definition from Michel de Graaf, and I'm going to follow what he did here and sort of go from the end to the beginning and break it up. So points that we've already made, and that is pigeons are created, used for limited communication among adults who are native speakers of other languages, mutually unintelligible languages. Therefore, what is the result in a pigeon is something that is unstable. It has not been nativized. It's a non-native. It's variable, inconsistent patterns. At least at the very start, it will later become more codified and become sort of community-wide in its use. The last point, pigeons are simplified. Lexically, they are structurally reduced. Now, Michel de Graaf, in his definition of Creole, gives a definition of a Creole, which is basically what he doesn't believe. All right. So that's why, as was pointed out in the video just now, he starts arguably. This is not de Graaf's position. But in any case, it is more the standard idea with respect to Creoles and pigeons. A Creole is a pigeon that has become a full-fledged language by stabilization, expansion, nativization, as the pigeon acquires native speakers and becomes the primary language for some or most of its speakers. A very good comparison here, pigeons and Creoles. Pigeons, no L1 speakers. It's everyone's second or other language. Creoles are spoken by those that is their home language, it's their native language, it's their first language. Pigeons, limited in purpose. Creoles have become used in all domains of life. Pigeons, variable, inconsistent. Creoles are systematized, they're more systematic. Pigeons, limited vocabulary. Creoles, because they have become used in all domains, they have a more diversified lexicon. Pigeons, no inflections. That's the kind of simplification that occurs. The affixes are gone. Creoles, there are inflectional affixes. So can Creoles be distinguished from other languages? Are Creoles special? All right. Are they exceptional? Now, the one side of the argument is Sally Mufwini, sorry, and Michel de Graaf. Their view is that Creoles develop under specific socio-historical conditions. Yes, plantation colonies. Yes, they are. There is a requirement that these slaves had to use the language of the colonizers. They had to use the language of those in the superstrate, and the enslaved people, they speak several different languages that are mutually unintelligible to one another. Creoles can be defined socially, but not in terms of linguistic structure. A very different view is John McWhorter. John McWhorter, Creoles are the world's simplest languages. Now, the point he's going to make is languages that have developed over time. English, French, Spanish, Chinese, they have all built up considerable complexity, but not necessarily a complexity that serves any particular functional purpose. I mean, there are remnants. It's just sort of like something that is old and it just carries on with certain things that maybe the meaning or the specific intent behind it has been lost. They're still there. Creoles have not yet had time to develop that complexity. They are young, they're not old, and Creole prototype no inflection, no tone, no lexicalization. Example, in looking at these 4 examples of Creoles, they do not use any inflectional morphology. So they do have that sort of particular characteristic that is unique to this set of languages. There's no lexicalization. Now, this again, something that develops over time, like husband, as was explained. Uh, understand, under and stand there. I mean, it's not like a combination of those two words. Instead, there is a periphrastic construction. There more words are used to express the same idea.